Welcome, everyone. I know that we are letting people into the room. We'll just take a couple minutes before we get started. Annie is very efficient, and so she thinks while we're getting started, we should go ahead and take the first poll. So if you'll fill out the answer to the first polling question, that'd be great.
Eugene, I'm trying to click yes, and then I'm like, oh no, host.
Yeah, I don't think we're allowed.
We are not allowed.
I know.
Let me just see how many. Annie, Missy, you want to put in chat how many people are in the room right now? Okay, they're just signing on. So we've got over 100 people registered. We'll give it a couple minutes.
Exactly.
The four of us were having a conversation before Shaquille and Brett signed on. Chris and I asked Chris, I said, so what's the status of, how pervasive is the conversation around AI? And Chris was saying, every meeting. So,
every meeting. Yeah.
Am I exaggerating, Chris? With board meetings, employee meetings, investor meetings?
Pretty much the last couple of months, yeah, I'd say 80% of the conversations that I'm having, certainly with folks outside of the company asking about the company, what they're most interested in is what are we doing, and probably half of our conversations inside are just about how we're using it, how we could be using it better, what other people are thinking. It is top of mind.
And then it was helpful when you reminded me, because when I said large learning models or large language models you guys had been using those for years. You corrected me on the technicality. So yes, AI has been used at Indeed forever. And then, so will you bring us forward on that, Chris?
Yeah, like the simple picture that we draw is AI is a very, very broad term that is sort of automated decision systems that can do things that would normally require human thinking. Machine learning is a very, very large subset, not all of it, but those are statistical learning models that are trained on data and can then make decisions. Neural nets are a subset of machine learning. Those have been around for a long time. Those we've been using and investing in for plenty of time. LLMs are a subset of neural nets and sort of an offshoot of natural language processing. That is a newer field of research. It's kind of like taking the NLP that's been around for a long time and just throwing way more data than anyone has ever thrown in it before. And that research has been going on for the last handful of years. We've been experimenting with LLMs for the last couple of years. ChatGPT has been around during most of that time, but 3.5 was released in December of 2022. And that was the real hockey stick in terms of going from interesting and curious and kind of funny to this thing can pass the 15 AP exams and the GRE and pass the California bar and the MCAT and do a whole bunch of stuff that people thought that only people could do before. So in terms of general interest and attention in AI, that I would recommend anyone just go to Google Trends and search for artificial intelligence and look at the trend from 2004 to the present. From 2004 to 2022, there was an increase in about 50% over 18 years in search interest in AI. And then it went up about 50% in 2022, and then it's gone up 250% just in 2023. So it's like, and that doesn't mean that AI has gotten that much better in the last year, but people's awareness and interest of it has skyrocketed just in the last 9 months.
Do that for AI chips, Chris.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Hey, well,
that's absolute skyrocket.
Let's get started. And first, thank you guys for being here, and to our audience, thank you for being here. I'm Eugene Sepulveda. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of Culturati. I want to welcome you to part 2 of our discussion on AI in the future of work culture. Part 1 was outstanding. We held that on July 13th. It is available for you to watch at Culturati On Demand. For those who are unfamiliar with Culturati, we're a community of thought leaders from around the country, various industries that thought leaders around the practice and the research around culture, how it helps us build and drive success in our companies and with our employees, and how we can help communities thrive. I also consider that we're the, kind of the community is the seawall protecting against the silly war against wokeism. Who doesn't believe the diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't better for our teams and our companies and our community? And, even sillier is this rhetoric against that we shouldn't be considering the environmental and societal impact, as well as seeking good governance practices. So the fight against ESG. Now the gamification that went on with ESG on Wall Street, that's a separate. But at Culturati, we believe that we can change the world through the workplace together. I'm going to introduce my good friend Shaquille, who's going to moderate today, and he'll introduce our other panelists. Shaquille has been writing about investing in AI startups since 2014. He's been in the software business for over 20 years, at the forefront of all emerging technologies, from client server to web to cloud to the Internet of Things. Shaquille has experience in a lot of industries, including finance, telecom, pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, advertising, distribution, retail, restaurants, and oil and gas. He's currently a partner and advisor of Capital Factory. And as a matter of fact, I love that his first investment at Capital Factory was with a healthcare startup, improving patient experience using AI. And Shaquille, that was 2014?
NLP. It was NLP, in 2014. Yeah.
I'll let, as I said, Shaquille introduce our two additional panelists and my friends, Brett and Chris. But I just want to say that Brett, I call the godfather of Culturati, and Chris, I call Buddhist high priest of business. Shaquille, I'll let you guys take it.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you. And just to continue from what Chris was talking about from ML and everything else, the first machine learning user group that I attended in Austin was at Indeed in 2015. It was like, that's where they started talking about how they're using NLP. That was one of the first things that I attended at Indeed in terms of AI. And of course, we have Brett, who has been very focused on the data side on this. So I won't spend as much time on introduction like I did with both of our guests last time. Brett Hurt, everybody knows in Austin in terms of CEO of Data.World, have taken Bazaar Voice public, have done Core Metrics before that. And then he is central to the startup universe in Austin, Texas here, and been great helper for so many different startups here, including all the content he puts out around his entrepreneur's framework and everything else. And Chris has been very involved and the CEO of Indeed since 2019. And prior to that, he led the product unit there in terms of product management and everything else. And Chris goes back all the way to Trilogy in Austin, Texas. So he's had tremendous impact. And both of them are very involved with several nonprofits and helping around way beyond what a lot of the people who are from the corporate world would generally be part of. And this is the most genuine work that I've seen from both of them on several topics like this. I just want to take a few minutes to summarize a few points from our first part one of this for each of our speakers, and then just ask some of the questions that we have ready. We want to keep time for audience questions today so that we can cover this topic even greater than what we hope to between three of us, right? So overall from Brett, we heard in part one that technology development has always been about productivity, seeking efficiency, And generative AI brings that same productivity similar to what the internet and the iPhone did for the technology world. And at data.world, he's seeing more than 30% of productivity gains just by using Copilot and similar tools for content and code. And to him, the big thing about ChatGPT and content generative AI is the fact that this intelligence is based on the content that has been created so far, right? And that brings a lot of different other aspects to it also, but that's one of his main things, that we are learning from something, that all the content that has been available to us. He's really impressed by the content that is produced by Ethan Malik on this topic. Ethan is from Wharton, which Brett supports a lot too. And he also talked a lot about Sal Khan's brilliant TED Talk on how every kid can now have a personalized tutor. Every kid and the teacher can now have a personalized tutor for learning, right? And he, in the realm of learning, he wants schools and universities to adapt LLM into their curriculum rather than ignore, or much worse, fight or regulate its usage. And from Chris, we heard several points of around this technology. We heard, and he took us back to the Turing test and how ChatGPT since last December gave the ability to everyone to play with AI, the AI that closely mimics human intelligence. And that has what got the excitement around generative AI and all the imagination going around it. In terms of his influencers, he looks at several people. He mentioned Ibrahim Kendi and how he emphasizes the fact that nothing is artificial. He talked about several other influencers, including Ted Chiang, and he talked about Sapiens and others in his talk. And he is incredibly excited and deeply concerned with this technology too, of course, including the bias and the consolidation of power and wealth around it. And when it comes to learning, one of the things that he really, I got a good point out of it, is saying that we as humans are learning by writing and hoping that students don't stop writing, since that's the best way for learning and developing your thinking. So I'll stop at that. He also mentioned in terms of the importance to be open, to be consistent, and the ability for kids to take more courses in ethics, history, philosophy. Closer to what we need is the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath in technology. And both acknowledge that there's a sea of change coming to jobs with respect to AI, but also emphasize that for a knowledge worker, the biggest strength is adapting to new technologies and being able to take that for more productivity and efficiency, right? Chris, Brett, would you like to add anything that I forgot or didn't mention from part one?
I think you did a great job, Shaquille. That's a great recap. And
that was not by ChatGPT, by the way. So
yeah, I also just make a point. I wrote a LinkedIn article as well, debriefing on part one, because I enjoyed the discussion so much. I always learn a tremendous amount from Chris and from you and Eugene. So I'll do the same after this one.
And I am going to put the link here in the chat for that, the article that Brett just mentioned. So excellent. So to start with, right, I wanted to get Chris started. He expressed this idea about being super excited and deeply concerned around the bias and the consolidation of power and wealth around generative AI. I wanted to actually get Chris started from there, since we stopped at that point and went into a different direction with startups and everything else at that time. So,
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that summary that you offered, I am incredibly excited and I'm incredibly concerned at the same time. And I think that any any tool that has an extraordinary amount of power, like AI, deserves both. And I think, you know, as folks who are working in building systems like this, the biggest challenge that I see is that we do not, as an industry, treat the potential for bias as a first-class problem. And so the example that I've used before is like QA. Anyone that develops software, we have reached a point that everyone for the last 30 or 40 years agrees software has bugs, right? It is not perfect. And so we've created this discipline that actually has an adversarial relationship to the engineering team, and a bunch of tools and processes with humans and automation to identify and root out and find and fix those bugs. And in fact, we also assume that even with all that, it's not going to work. And so we have exception handling in the case of customer support. And so, you know, the thought experiment is, what would happen if we all just assumed that software worked and threw QA out the window? My argument is that's what we're doing today with AI. And my belief is that we need actually a discipline that is a first-class discipline within software development that, for sake of argument, let's call FA, or fairness assurance, where we take the same approach that these systems are extraordinarily powerful, and because they're based on data that comes from humans and humans are flawed, they have all of the terrible things that we do as a species potentially baked into them. And unless we're looking directly for and trying to root them out and trying to build and counteract those, that we will be ossifying and hardening the bias in the systems. I will also assert that this is a harder problem than QA. And it has to start with the admission of the magnitude of the challenge, but it also has to start with building teams. Getting back to what Eugene mentioned at the start, it is more important than it's ever been to have teams that better represent the world around us. These are not problems, just to be totally frank, that will be solved by a bunch of white men, including people like me. So I think that there's a whole bunch. We can get into, you know, regulation and other things like that might need to be there. But I think the starting point is that the entire technology industry needs to bake into our foundation the idea that this is deeply potentially problematic. And if we don't treat it that way, then we could do a bunch of stuff that is super exciting and world-changing, but will have really negative and disparate impact on probably the majority of the world's population.
Brett, did you want to add something from the data governance point of view on this aspect of bias in data?
I mean, I think Chris's points are all spot on. What I would add is that everybody should watch the TED Talk given earlier this year by Eugene Choi. She is leading in this area to basically show how AIs can be very stupid at the same time, and that you need to create this foundation for common sense in them. But I think that those problems are going to get solved pretty quickly. I remain really bullish on those types of problems. But I would watch her talk as a critique on what we have today. I mean, one thing to remember is that this launch in terms of ChatGPT, which really popularized this launched on November 29th of last year. So, you know, Ethan Mollick, who I'm currently writing an article about, he's one of my favorite follows, and I was listening to Reid Hoffman's podcast, Possible, and I've been following Ethan Mollick for a while now. And Reid Hoffman was talking about in that podcast with Ethan Mollick on it, how he's the #1 person he follows. You know, Ethan Mollick makes this point of, remember that we're using the worst version of this today. I mean, this is so early on. You remember that when the iPhone came out, it didn't even have an app store, right? And so like a lot of things came along to make that technology much better. The reason I think that people are so spun up on this technology in particular is it speaks to us in a very human-like way sometimes, and then sometimes it makes such obvious mistakes. I was playing with Google's Bard yesterday, and it just made mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. And I kept on telling it was making a mistake, and it was really frustrating for me as a user, to the point where I'm like, well, I'm not going to try that version of an LLM for a while now, and just kind of continue to default to OpenAI's GPT-4, which is kind of amazing to think about it, that you're getting access to this super powered large language model for $20 a month, which is not a trivial amount of money, but it's not a lot of money either at the same time, if you think about the power that you're getting with that. So yeah, I would watch Eugene, Choi. I mean, there's clearly things to be critical on, and I think that those things will be fixed pretty quickly. I mean, you know, again, we haven't even hit the 1-year mark of this really reaching popular usage and being available to the masses. It was available in a very private, very programmatic context before that, but you know, all of this AI funding and everything else has really happened just in the last like 9 months, right? So, and these AI chip shortages, you probably saw NVIDIA's earnings last week, which were
absolutely
insane.
Yeah,
they grew at over 100% quarter at their scale, right?
Yeah. And this is a close to $1 trillion company doing that, right? And the ability to do that. I just put up a screen on screen some of the things that most people talk about when it comes to media mentions of ethical and responsible AI, right? And on the top is misinformation. Second, disinformation and propaganda.
Shaquille, I think you've got the wrong screen shared. We're seeing
okay.
What looks like
we're seeing
the
questions
or
media community are isolated. We're seeing what's the problem on social media communities.
Let me stop sharing and reshare that.
It's a cool comment from Debbie Johnson that she just got back from Japan and many hotels are using AI for Q&A.
Okay, does that show the right screen? No, that's not the one. Yeah, that's not the one. Okay. Let me ask Annie to see if she can share the one slide that we have.
Yeah, and maybe we can just assert that there are problems.
Right. Yeah.
So LLMs have problems of hallucinations, which are well documented.
Exactly.
And I don't know. I haven't heard any of the researchers in the field say that this is a problem that is actually solvable, let alone going to be solved soon, the way that they're built. But then the bias and toxicity are other things. They're built on top of massive corpuses of data, which include a whole bunch of hate and bias and a bunch of other things. And there's lots of people who spend all of their days just trying to figure out how to trick ChatGPT into saying something terrible. The easiest trick people have figured out is that all of the safeguards that are put in around language, but you can go in and ask it to write Python code, for example, to figure out who is more likely to be a good engineer, and it will literally write code that says, if candidate is a male, white male, the answer is yes, right? So there's like massive stuff that is baked into these systems, and so I will just reiterate that I think that we are very, very far from people even recognizing how big an issue this is, and that the debate continues to devolve into what, we can't stop innovation and be too careful. But I think the answer is that, innovation relies on care in the same way. Anyone who saw Oppenheimer will recognize that if you're building world-changing technology, you have to be really careful when you're doing it, because if things go wrong, it can be massively problematic.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to cover, similar to Eugene Choi, is Dr. Stephen Wolfram, who comes to Austin to Capital Factory on a regular basis. Also, he has been talking more on this side of hallucinations and how, by using his software, there can be some minimizing effects on the hallucinations. Of course, he doesn't talk about the biases and everything else, but he's more focused on the computational language that computers can understand better, so that they are getting the information from the right sources and be able to validate some of that. And there have been several places where I've come across where even ChatGPT 4, I thought ChatGPT 4 was lesser from a hallucination point of view, but there were many cases that have come to in terms of even it putting out information that it made up. It looks very real, but it made that up. There was a small article about poems of Rumi, and it actually created a poem of Rumi that does not exist. Right. So that, to me, those are things that really, for anybody who may not be as like, it may not know that, they may not even check that, right, and put that out as something that has been created. So it's going to be a loop, and of course there is no clear answer to the idea of biases, except for the fact that then the content that comes from other sources can be added and can be used for the development of these tools for answers, right? Microsoft shut down a project a few years back because they had issues with hallucinations, and the bot was actually taking up a personality, which was definitely not something that you would expect a machine to do, right? So let me jump into another question here. In terms of overall organizations, how do they navigate going from the general usage to organizations and successfully navigating the integration of AI within their own culture and work processes, similar to what you're doing at Indeed and similar to what you're doing at Data.world, right? Brett and Chris, what do you advise other organizations in that realm?
Yeah, we've actually progressed a lot just in 1 month since the last time we did this. I mean, one of our best programmers, someone that Chris knows really well, just posted to motivate the rest of the engineering team. He's a 58-year-old engineer, that he wrote 10,000 lines of code, which is what the amount that he would typically write in a year in the past couple of months. And he's like, this should not even be possible for me, and he writes in a very poetic fashion. So he's like, at my age, et cetera, but he's a genius. So one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. And he's really using that to try to motivate everybody else to follow his lead, because the productivity gains are so large, and the drudgery of coding, and coding has been abstracted for a long time. And back when I was a kid, I had friends that were older than me. I never did this, that coded in assembly language. And the last language I really coded in very seriously was C+. But it continues to get more and more abstracted. My son Levi knows 7 different languages now, and it's so abstracted from what I used to deal with. And large language models are an ultimate abstraction. GitHub Copilot being the most famous of those. And so I think it's people that are early adopters in your company, really shining a spotlight on them and showing what the art of the possible is. It's creating guidelines. There are legal guidelines you need to create about this. One of the things that's come up since that I would really encourage people to look at is that the way OpenAI works, it's kind of tricky on telling it not to share your data back to train their model. Like, you have to go through a lot of steps to do that. If you don't know what I mean by that, there's lots of documentation online about this, but you have to be really careful that you're not sharing confidential information, confidential customer information, for example, where you're under NDA. So I would get the legal department involved to work with your technology team to make sure you're not doing things that violate your contracts. But having said that, I would really lean in primarily to the art of the possible. It's being used now across all teams at Data.World. It is now our #1 OKR as well, to really be world-class with this, both internally and externally, which is a big shift for our company. This is an area where we really feel like we absolutely must lead on behalf of our customers. And there is a lot of work that just takes a tremendous amount of time that can be done much more effectively with these tools that aren't as subject to the hallucination problem. The hallucination problems tend to happen most commonly when you get to long tail type of content, but they don't happen as often when you're doing things like programming, which is much more literal, and it really depends on accuracy. And so that's an area where you can get an immediate lift. But yeah, it's a really, really exciting time for these technologies, and I think it's imperative that companies really lean in and get world-class at them, because they're inevitable for our future. There's no doubt about that. All the caveats, that Chris has made are really important caveats, but the reason this is being talked about so much, and the reason AI chips are flying off the shelves, the metaphorical shelves, I guess, as it were, at NVIDIA, is that
they're going into shelves of racks, basically.
Right, is that this stuff is the biggest productivity lifter in decades. And so to not be world-class with the biggest productivity lift in decades, whether you're a student at a school, whether you're a teacher at a school, whether you're a programmer, whether you're writing content, whether you're a BDR, our BDR team has really taken to this and are creating all types of personalized reach out at a level of scale that would not be possible with the size of our inside sales team. It's really, really fascinating and really exciting. But it does have its issues, like any new technology.
Yeah.
I'll add to that one of the things we talked about this a little bit last time, the biggest difference between almost all other AI that's come before and the large language models in the form of a chatbot is that it's just accessible to anyone. Mm-hmm. So we've been using AI both in our products since inception, and then also to increase productivity, across the business. We have specialized AI models that score leads when they come in. So we pass off the highest quality leads and route them directly to the right sales rep. And we have systems that, automate building models to identify untargeted groups that our marketing teams can go and build, marketing campaigns around. This is the first time that literally anyone in the company can sit down and figure out how to use AI to make themselves more productive. And so that's the big shift for us. I mean, we've been investing in this and using it, and it's sort of every part of the business. But in the last 6 months, we have teams on their own that are just diving into it, and now we've really started. We had our most recent offsite with our whole VP plus team, about 80 people. We spent the entire day with everyone, every single person hands on with ChatGPT, with our legal team giving a big introduction at the start, Brett, about exactly what can and can't go in. So it is really important to understand how those models work. And we have an enterprise-wide agreement with them where our use of the API, they can't use our data to train on, but anyone who just logs into ChatGPT, unless you jump through a bunch of hoops, you have to assume that they can use that. Yeah. So you just have to be aware of the usage of it. But we had every single team, from legal to marketing to finance, procurement, everyone was in there spending the entire day just figuring out how they could use it. And half the teams spent a bunch of time just talking about, here's all the things that we've already figured out in the last couple months. So it's an extraordinary shift in terms of opening up the opportunity for almost anyone to sit down and play around with it. And here's part of the challenge, though, is that all the stuff I said before about product and engineering teams and technologists who are maybe not thinking about all that stuff, once you get to people who are not in that realm, there's another layer of people who need to really become educated in what does work, what doesn't work, what some of the dangers are. And if you just think about, I don't know how often your mother calls you to ask about, she forgot her password on a site. That happens to me on a regular basis. Yeah. If my mom started using AI, we'd be in a different set of conversations. So I think it's really important for the general population to become much more educated about how these tools work and what the limitations are.
Yeah. As a follow-on to that, we got a great question from from Culturati saying, what training or upskilling opportunity should be provided to employees in an AI-driven organization? I thought that was really appropriate in terms of what we are talking about here.
I'll tell you, so we've just rolled out, we have our own, we have a large L&D team, and we have a bunch of tools. We just rolled out a whole bunch of AI related training for the entire organization. There's specialized stuff for different groups, but just an introduction at a high level to AI, to large language models. Here's the tools, here's safe ways to use them. We think it's incredibly important for every single person in the organization. We have a quarterly all hands meeting. The last one was 3 weeks ago, and the entire thing was just on AI. Here's what we're doing. Here's where we think it can go. And so I think it's no different than how organizations reacted or didn't react to the internet becoming something that was at everyone's fingertips. And if people don't know how to use it and what they might get from it, then organizations will face a lot of challenges.
Yeah, and we've done the same. I mean, I showed last time our AI hacks library. That's continued to expand. We've got very specific trainings now on AI. It's part of employee onboarding. We're actually taking one of our top leaders in the company and deploying them to look for AI lifts across all roles, because they've done such a good job of that with their specific department. And they're really excited about that opportunity to really create that leverage across the entire company. One thing that I think is really important too is that a lot of the fears that people have about AI, and a lot of what's been kind of transposed from dystopian sci-fi, whether it's the Matrix or anything else, is based on a leap that is so far away, at least in my opinion, from where we're at today. And that leap is to artificial general intelligence, where the fear is that machines then run away with intelligence because of their scale, to a point where they're so far intelligent above us that they essentially then decide that we're no longer relevant and decide to rule the world. And we're kind of those pests, kind of like we'd look at an ant colony or something like that. that we're so far away from that. And frankly, the financial incentives aren't nearly as strong to create that versus specialized AIs that really help you get much more efficient at a certain task inside of a company or a certain department level work, whether it's insight selling, whether it's programming, whether it's QA, whether it's personalized content at scale, like I was talking about earlier, customer support. These are things that will really be the primary focus because the ROI is so easy to measure. And frankly, that's where these large language models and other forms of AI are going to be most exciting. And the kind of the fear of AGI is I think causing people to trip up and get too concerned about where we're at today, which in my opinion is very, very far away from that fear even being possible. And there's so many gates that need to happen. And I'll give you an example, like there was a while back where Microsoft released a chatbot that was trained on content, and it started to spout like Nazi propaganda and racist slurs, and they shut it down really quickly. There's a good example of when this got even close to out of control, right? It was immediately shut down, not to see the light of day until it was completely retooled. And that's not even an AGI. That was just a chatbot. That was just a large language model. So we'd have to go through so many gates societally and stumble through so many things to actually get to an AGI future.
Yeah.
I just don't think that there's that many financial incentives to get to that future versus just lots and lots of specialized AIs for every single thing today that's done manually that could be done much more effectively through automation, which any human being would want from the standpoint of, hey, I want to be much more effective and efficient in my job. Like, I talked about the drudgery of coding. I actually love coding. But what I meant by that is that if you could work with an abstracted language versus assembly language, you do it, right? And
do it.
I've already seen that because almost everybody programs that way. And so, the drudgery part comes when something's invented that makes your job much more efficient. And why would anybody want to do it the old way if you're now just going through work that's now been much more easily available to you to do more efficiently and effectively?
Right.
I'll just add really quickly that while I agree AGI is a ways off. I disagree that there's no incentive. So like OpenAI, their mission is to create AGI. It's on their homepage as to create AGI that is safe to benefit all humanity. But it's a extraordinarily well-funded organization, and that is what they claim the focus of the business is. So I think there are people who are working on it, but I'm more concerned, and this is where part of it is me as a human, part of it is my day job. Our mission is to help people get jobs. We focus on the world of work, and I am extraordinarily concerned about the impact on jobs based on how these systems are built and how they are deployed, and that's where I think it's the hallucinations or problems that come with these systems are kind of funny and quirky in certain areas, and then when it comes to if they're hallucinating about making a decision about someone's employability or about how they are identified coming through TSA or on CCTV, by the police, these things become much more serious than just this is a little problem we can work around. So that's where I would love to. I know that we were talking about getting to the topic of regulation, so I'm just going to throw it out there. Like I do believe that regulation is required. I think that and I know that for most technologists that sounds like it's sort of anathema, but let's just take a minute and say, how did crypto work out? And that has such relative to what we're talking about here, minimal implications. You have a bunch of people who lost a ton of money, and that's the only bad thing that happened. But that, was due to a lack of regulation. I think one of the problems is that the people who are supposed to be doing this are ignorant, and I use that word in the very literal sense of the implications of these. So lawmakers are not necessarily the best ones to be coming up with these things. So I think actually we as a field need to work with them and start proposing what they look like. I think, the FDA has kept us somewhat safe, but has also been a challenge there. I mean, there's a ton of amazing research of FDA, studies that have massive bias baked into them because there's nothing in the regulation about that. So like
That's right.
the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging, which is the longest study, in the history of medicine, followed these people for like 50 years, and it was 1,000 men and 0 women. And so there's like 100 examples of this, and we've seen 8 out of 10 of the medications that were withdrawn from the market in the late 90s. 80% of them were because they caused greater health risks for women. So I think that like Title VII in employment is a pretty good model. Will these things potentially slow down innovation? I think that innovation needs to move at a cautious pace, and I don't think it's going to actually slow things down. But I think it's really important for us to like agree that we can't go the way of crypto for something that is infinitely more powerful.
Right.
Yeah,
I think it's a question of balance, right? So it's a question of balance in terms of these regulations versus the innovation. So yeah, go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it's a question of balance, and the FTC is racing along with this. I'll share a link on that front that breaks it down. But one of the concepts that I shared before TED, because I knew that AI was going to be one of the main topics, is what's been called sandbox regulation, where essentially innovators keep regulators apprised and included, but they're not bound by rigid oversight and rules. And the FTC is trying to strike this balance. I'll share that link in there. But I would just be skeptical though of if we let OpenAI and the others lead us to regulation, then my biggest fear there is that the largest companies that stand to benefit, like essentially shut everybody else out during a time where it's in such nascency. I mean, one of the things that's really exciting to create balance in the force here is that Facebook or Meta has been releasing large language models in terms of open source. There's downsides and upsides to that, right? But I would say there's mostly an upside to that as processing power and energy becomes more and more ubiquitous through solar and other means. There's a lot to be said on a company saying, hey, this type of large language model technology should fundamentally be free. And that's a real threat to business models that depend on you paying for it. So there are, it depends on like who's in the tent with the regulators on how it gets regulated. If it gets regulated in a way where it's just protects the large incumbents, then we don't have a lot of competition, and therefore we don't have a lot of innovation, and therefore we don't have a lot of focus on the problems that Chris has pointed out, which I agree with, right? Because the way you get past those, the way you solve those problems is you have lots of people innovating to create better and better versions that don't have these problems that we're talking about. And if it's left in the hands of just the few and it gets regulated that way, then we've really failed. I mean, imagine if the internet was regulated that way at the beginning and there were like 5 websites, owned by, big companies that essentially made up all the rules and stifled all the innovation on the internet, we would all been pretty sad about that kind of scenario.
No, I think the balance part is, again, going back to that in terms of what both Chris and Brett have said, and the fact that some of these regulations may be led by some of the larger organizations, right? Similar to what we see in the pharma side, like if we are comparing for FDA, the larger pharma had figured out loopholes in the system. That's the whole opioid crisis that got created, right? Mm-hmm. Even though they were FDA approved and everything else. So there is some balance that comes through from both of these sides in terms of the innovation that is going on, in terms of companies developing things that they can benefit from, along with all the other benefits and everything else that comes through society for this, right? This technology, to me, like Brett, you brought up the point that you're using this technology for very personalized messages to your audience. And one of the things that we covered in a panel last week at Pet Supernova at Capital Factory was how the disinformation creators are doing the same. They are able to create messages that resonate with whatever truth they believe in, and being able to push that envelope further, right? So there are things that are possible with this whole productivity from both the good side as the bad side. Like Chris said, the Oppenheimer movement in this, right? So we definitely want to seem like we are being aware of all these things. We have about 10 minutes left through. I believe we want to give time for Q&A. And I know David Altunian had put up a couple of questions that I wanted to go back to, actually. Let me just pull that up. So David is coming from an education point of view in terms of what he is doing at the universities. They are definitely adapting the LLMs and everything else, but it does bring in other short-term challenges for organizations that are seeking employees to understand, and how, in terms of the risks of misapplications of AI output by employees, and what are some, have you seen any case? I know it's early on, we are still talking about all the good parts that employees have done using AI technologies that are available to them. Have you seen anything that has come from within your organization that didn't seem like the right thing within the organization from the employees? Any examples?
I don't have a good example of that yet. I mean, I on the education front, again, I would highly recommend tuning into Ethan Mollick, David, and seeing how he's working through those issues, because he's written about all of those quite publicly. And I've certainly read about lots of issues. Like I read about the lawyer who used OpenAI to do analysis and found out it was making up some some cases, and then used those in the court without double checking, and got really reprimanded by the judge. So you have to check your work here. That has always been the case, and there's been lots of disinformation on the internet since the invention of the internet. And it behooves you to check your work, in that world. So in this world, it does as well.
There is a comment here by Joel House saying Chris is linking AI to cultural engineering. I am conservative and don't see the value proposition to use the tool to change society. It will change society driven by users and consumers who find value in what is produced. Would you like to address that, Chris?
Sure. I mean, it is my opinion that capitalism is, it's kind of like the Winston Churchill quote about democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government possible, except for all the others. Capitalism is the worst form of, economic models, except for all the others. Capitalism has extraordinary power, and we are on Zoom here talking to each other and having these conversations and building the systems because of capitalism. But capitalism has extraordinarily dark implications. To me, I mean, the conversation here is about, it's kind of like what good science fiction does, right? We're trying to say, with the introduction of a new technology, what is the impact on society? And I think it is impossible to ignore the fact that a technology with this power will impact society. And as people who are practitioners who are building these systems, or who are businesses who are going to be purchasing and using them, I think we have a massive ethical obligation to understand that. And I don't believe that unchecked capitalism and unchecked, Darwinism is the best for society. Now, that's something we could debate, but I feel very strongly about this personally, and this is how I'm, walking the earth and how I'm trying to run my business and trying to encourage a whole bunch of other people to think that way, because I think we ignore that at our own peril.
I'll take one counter to that in terms of how I actually think this is going to help capitalism a lot.
And Brett, you're part of conscious capitalism, right? So
I am. Yeah. When I was on the podcast, Austin Next podcast, great local podcast. One of the things that I posed is that I really think this is going to create millions of new startups, because the cost of doing so is so dramatically reduced. And the more startups, the more you have people taking swings to try to make things better for society, the more you have, the more hits you have. And if the barrier is so high to learn programming, for example, that they're just the rare few that can take that swing at the bat, who have had the societal advantages of the right schooling and the right training and everything else. You're going to see a lot more startups, even if their individual size is smaller than before, because they have these superpowers of creating code and content at scale much more easily with much less friction. And so I'm very bullish on that aspect of this technology. And some of those solutions will address the concerns that Chris has brought up. I'm very confident of that. It'll address the bias concerns and everything else.
So just because we're running out of time, I just want to make sure that I underscore that I think this stuff is amazing, and we are all in, and I'm super invested, and I think it's going to be world transforming. And I think it's important to be careful at the same time. The analogy that I've used, Brett, Andy Maggs, good friend of mine.
I do. Yeah.
Andy's a private pilot. He loves aviation. Outside of his family, it's his favorite thing in the world. And he is the most extraordinarily careful and methodical aviator who does everything that is required plus 100% more, does all of his pre-flight checks, will never fly when the weather isn't looking quite right, because he has so much respect for the power of it. And so I just want to be really clear. I think this is the most amazing and life-changing innovation of our lifetimes. And I think that we need to be careful so we can preserve the value.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm right there with you. And on the argument for regulation, there hasn't been a commercial airline crash in the last 14 years in the US in terms of death, at least. And that's comforting to me, because I'm flying out to San Francisco later today. So I mean, there's an example where regulation really matters. So I'm not anti-regulation. I just think we have to be really thoughtful in the way that we do it, to not stunt an incredible productivity opportunity for us all, to make us all much more efficient, and therefore able to create a lot more beautiful things together.
I couldn't have said it better than both of you in terms of the balance and using the example of flight versus the regulations around it. In terms of the overall, there were a lot more questions as usual. I had something about UBI and everything else also. But I think this whole idea of the balance between innovation, the implications to society, and being able to regulate things, where is the data coming from? I doubt many of us have actually dealt at this level of complexity between all of the forces coming through, and it will require a lot more from organizations like Culturati, organizations like Conscious Capitalism, and others to be able to present some of these and work together with organizations overall for making the best out of this for the best for the society in the future. So with that, I think I'm ready to sign off. So
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Eugene.
Chris.
Great
Thanks,
chat.
Phil. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone who
Thank
joined.
you, Misty and Andy. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.